Thank you, everybody. Thank you to those of you who are staying on from our conference. And now I think we have some viewing live stream, so welcome to DIIS. This session is a book launch of a book we thought we would have as a physical copy. We have now a PDF copy, and thanks, Runa, for printing it to us. So officially, it will be in our hands November 15th. But we're going to launch it today as originally planned. And in this context, Joanna, Bourke, and myself will be presenting the book. We are co-editors of it. And David Kieran, who has been speaking during the conference now several times, has agreed to pitch in and make some comments. And then we'll open it up also to discussion, both for those of you in the room and for those of you online. So let me start off. First of all, I want to say thank you to Joanna. This project grew out of the New Psychology of War project, funded by the Independent Research Fund of Denmark. And we held a conference in 2018 as part of the project. Joanna Bourke has been part of our advisory board, and I said, how about let's doing this together? And she said, sure, as she always does, and we did. And from this 2018 conference emerged a group of papers that have gone through various permutations and now will be publicly available here. We have several, actually, of the authors for the book in this room: Peter Lees, Nancy Sherman, Johannes Lang, both Joanna and myself, and hopefully some of our authors are watching online. So what we wanted to do today is give you just a quick whiff of what the book is about and a brief walkthrough of some of the arguments in the chapters, because we think they're important and interesting. And David will tell us if he thinks otherwise, and then we'll chat. So the question we're struggling with, also an issue we've visited several times during the conference, has been, what does it mean to think about violence? What does violence do to people who have different positions, roles, experiences? And what does it do at different junctures in time? In this whole discussion of resilience and the project, which we are now celebrating the completion of, is very much situated around 9/11, with the terrorist attacks in New York and against the Pentagon, and the devastation that was widespread, both for those individuals and families whose lives were directly impacted by the terrorist attacks, but also for Americans worldwide, those of us who watched it on television. At the time, I remember I was chatting with John about this. I was living in Denmark at the time. I'm a U.S. citizen, but have been living in Denmark for decades. I was walking on the walking street, Købmagergade, one sunny afternoon, and this was everyone having their cell phones in their hands, and somebody gave me a flyer. This was a CNN flyer about the attack on the World Trade Towers. And I thought, is this right? Let me go upstairs and turn on the television. So I went upstairs and turned on the television and saw the first of the millions of images of the attacks. And I thought, oh my goodness, I hope nobody got hurt. I'm sure nobody got hurt, otherwise they would have said so. This inability to comprehend. I mean, it was completely idiotic initial reaction. So what does it mean when a society, a government, a military institution is faced with something that at the time seemed unprecedented? Of course, many countries argued this was not unprecedented, talking about colonialism and the U.S. wars internationally. But for us Americans, since Pearl Harbor, this seemed unprecedented to have an attack on our soil. So what impact would this have on American culture? This is one of the questions behind our research project. And whereas at the time, there was this expectation that there would be massive trauma and PTSD, and that costs, as we've heard. In fact, that was not the primary reaction. There was largely a return to normal. And in this era, this return to normalcy after some months, after the posters of the missing family members got faded and peeled from buildings in New York City, the notion of resilience began to make a headway into the institutions of the military. Resilience is a word coming from the Latin resiliere, which means to jump back, recoil, rebound, and it is a concept that travels across many disciplines. It originally had a great impact in ecological sciences and then in economics. And because of this quite different context-based meaning, people have viewed it in very different ways. One view is that, well, it's just a buzzword. It's just empty, so why spend time on it anyway? And other people will say, no, it's ambiguous, but ambiguity is productive, and so forth. So our curiosity in this book was, what has it meant as it was institutionalized in the U.S. military? As we've talked over the last 2 days, the U.S. military during the forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan saw highly increased incidences of PTSD in the military. And the epidemic of suicide among soldiers and veterans. How can we send our young men and women, though mostly men, to war and then they kill themselves? So the intensity of the need from the public for a responsible response was quite apparent by 2007. And it was in this context that Martin Seligman, a psychologist and considered one of the fathers of positive psychology, was able, through a variety of coincidences, circumstances, and so forth, to have a meeting with top brass in the Defense Department and peddle his program for resilience training. This Master Resilience program, what became developed as the Comprehensive Soldier Fitness and Soldier and Family Fitness program. And he would make arguments. I know Milo has often had this sort of poster of this. He would say, we can train people to bounce back like a tennis ball instead of break like an egg. So his argument was not that he could solve the problem of trauma, but through training, he could diminish the incidence of how many people were traumatized and thereby also give resources for what has been called post-traumatic growth. This is also a term we've talked about over the last couple of days. So it was adopted. It sounded like a quick fix. Is Amelia looking at me? And soldiers were required to take tests to test their levels of resilience, and they were taught skills through online trainings to hunt the good stuff and avoid thinking traps and use their feeling thermometers, all of which can be very commonsensical, good sort of human relational skills. But it does a couple of things. First of all, it's based on a very different conception of trauma. It's a conception of trauma, I know Joanna talks about this in our book, which is based on an earlier World War I conception that trauma resides in weak character. And therefore Seligman says, well, there's some things in weak character that can be trained. We'll do that. And if you take that view, that it's the weak character problem that's the source of trauma, then he had his fix. If you take the other view, that it's not character but the event, also something Milla's been working on in her PhD, then you recognize that war and natural catastrophe put people in a situation in which we are all potentially vulnerable, looking at trauma instead of the event. So it presents us with a wrong picture of what trauma is, and it also presents us with a set of skills that are very disproportionate to the gravity of problems. we're talking about soldiers and their families where they face multiple deployments. Families are relocated multiple times, also within the U.S. That means they lose their social support, their family support, their networks, they lose their jobs. Spouses are encouraged to get some kind of job which is geographically mobile. This is something also very popular during COVID, online work. It introduced tools which just are quite disproportionate to the gravity of the question what violence and war does to people. So in this cultural context, we see that concepts have worked in certain ways. The notion of resilience has become securitized. Resilience becomes a way of responding to war and national catastrophe, hurricanes and forest fires, and security becomes psychologized. It becomes a question for individuals to become robust and train themselves. And if we do that as individuals, then the government doesn't have to worry about its role. And of course, resilience, we argue in the book that resilience is really a concept of and for our times. We know certain concepts seem to capture its era. And the capture that we see in this is that we are faced with so many crises. Nuclear catastrophe, climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, ongoing war, just when we thought we had gotten through it. And if you buy the narrative of resilience, then that's not a problem because it gives us control. All we have to learn to do is adapt. And we can do that, and therefore a crisis doesn't have to be the end of the story. So of course, this is an ongoing debate, and resilience is used in very many contexts, but in the context of the authors who have contributed to this volume, there are several critical voices where authors point out that resilience becomes a way of responsibilizing individuals for factors for structural violence, inequalities, that really should be taken up on governmental, both local, national, and intranational levels. And hence it is similar to the critique of neoliberal governments that we hear. With that, I'll turn the word over to Joanna.
Thanks, and I just want to also start by saying what a pleasure it was to work with you, Robin. Absolute pleasure, but also to all the contributors in this volume. And in the process, I mean, I just learnt so much. So I just wanted to preface my remarks by saying thank you to each and every one of you in this room, and also being anyone watching on the live stream. What I'm going to do is introduce the second sort of big concept of the book. The book is called Resilience. That's the really big concept, but the subtitle is Military and Militarization. So I want to speak a little bit about the militarization bit of resilience. Then I want to speak a little bit about individual chapters, and then I'm going to hand it back to Robin to speak about other individual chapters in the book. I mean, clearly, as Robin has already said, resilience, the founding myth, if you like, of resilience was 9/11 and the crisis that it sparked. I mean, it didn't create the crisis, but it sparked huge anxiety about a crisis, particularly within the US military, where there's major mental health problems. Repeated deployments of soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan had caused an epidemic of PTSD, for example. 16% of serving soldiers and vets presented with PTSD, compared to 7% over a lifetime in the general population. They also saw massive increases in suicides, in sexual violence, in domestic abuse, alcohol and drug dependency. These soared threatening not only operational effectiveness, but indeed the status of the US military itself. And the adoption, as we've already heard, the adoption of this resilience model marked a dramatic shift from the trauma or PTSD models that had been employed prior to 9/11. Traumatic events came to be seen as not only inevitable, but the responses to those bad events not inevitably traumatic. So even though the bad events are inevitable, the responses are not inevitably traumatic. And the key term that comes up time and again in this very complex and often contradictory concept of resilience are choice and elasticity. Individuals can go stronger or weaker as a result of their experiences. So there's a shift, especially in military training regimes, away from institutional or community responsibility and towards kind of these notions of individual character. Adaptability rather than vulnerability, flexibility rather than rigid rule following, and crucially, post-traumatic growth. As the subtitle of the book says, the key concept in the book is the second key concept in the book is militarization. Although, as Joanna points out in his chapter, resilience and resilience training did not originate in military contexts. A major theme of the book is the militarization of this concept of resilience. Perhaps this is not surprising given the size of the US military, 1.4 million personnel on active duty, a budget well over $715 billion. And you get this kind of acceptance that war is permanent, mowing the grass, as one Israeli expert put it. In terms of definitions, there are a number of subtly different definitions of militarization in the book. I think the one that I hope most of the authors can agree with, though, is Cynthia Enlow's definition of militarization as a step-by-step process by which a person or a thing gradually comes to be controlled by the military or comes to depend for its well-being on militaristic ideas. So, how has resilience been militarized? And in the book, I think we have three broad responses to that question. First, resilience has been militarized in the sense that the concept exerts a formidable impact on all aspects of life within the military, within the armed forces. Now, this is, of course, not to imply that the various components of resilience programs are cohesive, consistent, all pervasive. In fact, they're not, and many of the chapters actually document exactly this point. The profound contradictions and inconsistencies within the militarized version of resilience. They also, of course, the concept also ignores fundamental aspects of life, such as poverty, racial and gender discrimination, military disciplinary norms, and multiple dependencies and multiple vulnerabilities, perhaps is a better term there. The second way, broadly, that we see resilience as being militarized is just the way the concept has become central in the way the armed forces project this kind of public image. Militarism is legitimated through the figure of the resilient warfighter. So it's a counter to the patent failure of the military to protect its own members, the PTSD statistics I gave earlier, and so on. This failure is therefore shifted from the military as an institution onto the individual. Indeed, repeated deployments themselves are made possible through the mobilization of positive psychology. And this is a profoundly depoliticizing move, again, a theme of quite a few of the chapters. And third, the militarized version of resilience has then spread throughout society, affecting every aspect of it, including entertainment or militainment. As chapters in this book show, this is a highly gendered, the way it's spread into all sorts of society is a highly gendered practice, which includes the weaponization of psyches, the weaponization of family life, and the weaponization of spirituality. As I argue in Wounding the World, this has effectively turned US and British peoples into citizen soldiers. And this move that we see has actually really important American inflections, which, as Peter Lees here argues, has been neocolonial in impact and destructive of alternative ways of healing, in a really powerful chapter in the book. As he argues, there are other traditions of dealing with the traumas of war, ones that draw upon more humanistic and anti-militaristic practices and ideologies that arise independently of processes of medicalization or militarization or profit-making, and actually encourage empathy for the sufferings of others. These are illustrated by Peter's work, who he draws on the life and thinking of Jonas Mekas, a leading member of the New York underground film movement and Lithuanian exile. The chapter, I think, by Johannes is the one that really, which starts the book after the introduction, really sets the scene for all the chapters that follow. I mean, his chapter is the most robust analysis of the history of resilience, from the time that the concept entered the psychological sciences in the late 1960s until it was adopted by the US military from 9/11. Unsurprisingly, given his extensive work in the field, he draws upon a depth of literature and interviews to show how positive psychology served as a counter to the medicalized narratives about trauma and PTSD that had come to dominate discussions about war and mental health in decades since the Vietnam War. Positive psychology provided the military with a concept that could tell a different story about the psychological aftermath of war to the story that was very, very popular. His chapter is followed by one by Nancy Sherman, on the way that a distorted reading of ancient Stoicism could actually be profoundly productive for service members and institutions more generally. As we heard yesterday, the mantra of suck it up was widely embraced. Pain as weakness leaving the body. Using examples drawn from military drill and professional dance, she emphasizes the importance of corporeal communication as this kind of, as key to building on the one hand, but also, more importantly, sustaining social grit. More controversially, she draws on neuroscience, arguing that it's worth exploring at least the neurocognitive science of mirror neuron cells to help us understand complex forms of empathy and social understanding. As she puts it, she seeks to show how the social supports of resilience are built at a very basic motor level. Those social supports in mirrored cadenced steps helps secure the connections that allow soldiers to trust each other and turn to each other as they try to make sense of the moral ambiguities of war. Healing from the moral anguish of war comes, in no small part, she argues, in knowing one doesn't go to war alone, fight war alone, or come home alone. Now, I've already mentioned the remarkable chapter by Peter, who draws attention to alternative traditions. In his words, resilience is not the instrument of military management efficiency presented in the comprehensive soldier fitness program in the present, but rather, and this is his crucial phrase, but rather a range of communal processes of recovery and justice seeking. And central to his arguments is the importance of cultural factors. That is, and he's spoken eloquently about this in the last couple of days, culture-bound responses to trauma, which provide different models that actually we may be good to think more about. But then, of course, after Peter's chapter, we turn again to the negative, which is my chapter, on the bullet proof. So it was a high point, Peter, high point. Bulletproof mind. Like all the other chapters in the book, I make the point that resilience does significant political and ideological work. And I illustrate this by looking at the US Marine Corps. My chapter also looks at the spread of notions about the long war and the war fighter, especially in relation to operational stress control and readiness and the comprehensive soldier and family fitness programs. These initiatives created tensions in part because of the differences between the sort of macro policies and micro implementations. Attempts were made to distinguish the inevitable distress of combat from the avoidable traumas. In other words, another part of this was that sort of vulnerability and suffering are embraced as intrinsic to the warring enterprise. They are shared traumas. The baptism of fire is what creates the war fighter. Sarah Names has this next really interesting chapter, which takes us in a different direction again, even though there are links, particularly with Peter and Johannes's chapters, where she explores resilience as a human resource model for personnel management. Her chapter begins from this premise that soldiers are workers and that the army has crafted a human resource management tool to deal with workers, designed to curate the wellness of its employees more efficiently. And crucial to her argument is the idea that the US Army has become a testing ground for psychology, especially organizational and particularly positive psychology. And she does this through an analysis of the Global Assessment Tool, GAT, as a tool to make soldiers more lethal in armed conflict, satisfied with their life, and cost efficient for the government. Like all the chapters, she emphasizes the politics of resilience, one which depoliticizes ideologies, structures, and practices of war making. And I'm going to pass over to Robin to discuss the other chapters.
I'm on. So, and the final section of the book is looking at intimate lives, as Joanna mentioned, intimate lives, and how resilience in the military has impacted marriages, family life, and spirituality. And Susan Carruthers, Susan, are you watching us today? Has a beautifully written chapter where she delves into the history and presence of how military uses romantic love, reminding us of the old adage that there was an earlier view that if the military wanted you to have a wife, it would have issued one. But of course, especially in the context of unending wars, you can't expect that thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers will be unmarried over long periods of time. So that was part of this current historical conjunction that one had to then support wives and families because we needed those soldiers. Of course, Susan points out that this is a highly gendered use. There are many women in active duty in the military, but the images that are used also in talking about love and talking about resilience are highly gendered. And she goes us through some of the stories back to Vietnam about the Dear John letters. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where it is claimed many girlfriends and wives wrote Dear John letters breaking up with their soldiers while they were on the front in the theater of war. And therefore, if soldiers went AWOL or had drug abuse or used violence in the family or killed themselves, it was her fault because she wrote that letter at the wrong time. And so there's been the whole sense of how to instruct women to be the right kind of girlfriend, the right kind of family. And as she notes very compellingly, of course, this way of blaming, another version of blaming women for the problem of what war does to soldiers, but it does produce something very useful for the Army, because if women are to blame, then your best friend is the soldier, the male soldier next to you. So the way it really supports this sense of camaraderie, the homosocial bonds that is at the basis of so much military life. In my article, again, with Joanna, I'm on a negative note. I talk about how resilience, in my view, is really a failed concept, making the argument both conceptually and practically. As I mentioned earlier, in some sense, the severity of the problems. We've been talking about ignorance before. What do people know? What do we don't? What do we not know? The military families have been in deep crisis with alcohol abuse, domestic abuse, guns in the home, which of course make any threat of violence much worse. A highly authoritarian culture since the 70s. People have pointed out that this is the breeding ground for domestic violence. And in that context, peddling these, internet trainings on resilience really seems woefully inadequate. And in this context, resilience becomes another version of what scholars have called an anti-politics machines, in which everything becomes psychologized. And hence, we've also talked over the past 2 days about some of our expert informants, William Nash, Brett Litz, who I think give much better alternative paths. What would it mean to take trauma seriously? What would it mean to understand that there is a very long process after returning from the theater of war, where requiring both caring relationships and moral values for long periods of time, and requiring governments to provide that physical and psychological health care in the long run. And the final chapter in the book by our colleague Ruth Lees talks about how spirituality is treated in this bizarre universe of testing, the global assessment tests, GATT tests. And she argues, I think rightly so, that we have to put this in the universe of the broader trend in cultural theory, certainly in American culture, about how to view spirituality, where spirituality has become increasingly viewed as what you believe is who you are. You can call this the ontological turn. And if what you believe is who you are, then you don't have to argue for it. You don't have to worry about, is it being true or false? Do you have the right information or not? It's just who you are. And in her view, the logic of the way in which the U.S. has measured spirituality and trains it through these GATT tests is very much this turn to it's just who you are, and you don't need to worry and argue about your beliefs. So with that, we're done, and we turn the floor over to David.
All right, well, maybe I'll stand up for this. So I want to first congratulate both of you and all of the authors on this book. having edited a couple of volumes and often been the contributor that the editors are haranguing to get their essay in, I know the challenges that go into this. And so it's really a wonderful book, and it's so timely and so important. This usually doesn't happen, but several times when I was reading the manuscript, I happened to either be on airplanes or in airports, and every time somebody looked over at what I was doing and said, "What are you reading about?" And I would tell them, and they would have some story about a member of their family who was in the military and the experience of deploying. And so I think that this book really comes at a really critical moment at the end, sort of these wars, to be thinking about this. So resilience came up a lot when I was working on my book, Signature Wounds. At one point, George Casey actually told me I should take the GAT to find out what my mental fitness was, and I wasn't able to do that, but it was this moment when clearly the military had invested deeply in it, but there hadn't been a lot of scholarship around it, and frankly, I gave it short shrift in my book, and others who've written about it. There were a few people, Alison Howell, Emily Sogan, who had written about it, but a lot of us who were writing about this era were just touching the edges of it. So this book is really, I think, critical because it is the first book to give us that in-depth look at the many ways resilience is functioning. And what I was struck by when I was working on my project was the debate that had transpired inside the Army, how much so many people in the leadership had bought into resiliency fully. George Casey, Patty Horoho, Carl Castro, Rhonda Cornum, that resiliency was going to be the future of mental health in the military, but also that it sat uncomfortably with other people in the military who felt like this pushed treatment to the side, whether it was, in a sense, shutting the barn door after the horse had gotten out. I remember somebody saying to me, this is the equivalent of telling somebody who has cancer that they should eat right and exercise when what they need is chemotherapy. And there was a sense also that this flattened out the various kinds of trauma that people experience, right? That importing this model of positive psychology directly into the military really overlooked the way in which the experience of deployed troops and families during wartime is quite different. As one person that I interviewed said, well, you need to be resilient in life. If you ask somebody out on a date and they say no, you need to be able to recover from that. And I thought that's really quite different from being in Iraq. And there was also a sense that there was resilience needed to be cultivated not because of the wars, but because somehow American culture as a whole had gone soft. And I remember one person saying, we need to teach this in every elementary school. We need to teach this in every high school, because by the time we get them, it's almost too late. You know, and there's a lot that goes into the question of when we get them, right? But there's also this idea that it wasn't, that Americans weren't coming into the military sufficiently tough, right? And so there were so many ideas about resiliency that needed to be unpacked, and I think this book starts to get there and really grapples with the question of what is an army in the midst of two prolonged wars to do about a mental health crisis. And one of the essays in the book makes the point that by 2006, 2007, the Army is in this real crisis with the PTSD rate, with the suicide rate, with the rates of other mental health conditions, with family crises, right? And so in that sense, you know, we start to see the impact of multiple deployments on troops, and particularly with an all-volunteer force. At one point, Peter Corelli, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, goes before Congress and he says, this is a supply and demand issue. You either have to reduce the demand or you have to give me more people. But if you keep doing this, the Army will not sustain itself. And so I think, in a way, we approach this project, or I approach this project and your work, thinking about, on the one hand, understanding why the military was looking for this solution, right? We have to do something. And yet we need to be critical, or cast a critical gaze on the solution that they chose and its elements. So in the end, I think we don't want to give the military, the Army, a pass for the failures of resiliency, and I agree with Robin's conclusion that it is a failed project. I think our current active duty suicide rate in the force shows that this turn to resiliency has been ineffective at best, right? And I, at the same time, don't want to take attention away from the larger cultural conditions that create these wars. So I'm really glad to see this collection, and I just want to highlight some of the ways that the chapters expanded my thinking on this topic. And I'll try and do so briefly so we have time for lots of discussion, but I think the real strengths of the book come in some of the chapters that give us the history of resilience and this wider view of what resilience could be. So Johannes' chapter, Peter's chapter are really wonderful in that they teach us that the model that the military chose, this model that the University of Pennsylvania positive psychology folks brought to the military, was one option of what resiliency could look like, when there was a much larger history and a variety of other approaches that could have been available. And I think the some of what we heard yesterday in Edgar's presentation around what makes people able to recover from trauma, what makes units, and it has to do with good leadership and a sense of purpose and training and rest and unit cohesion. And this made me think of Peter's chapter and the idea of community and how different community models could offer an alternative to the kind of resiliency that's based in this individualized model. Right? And I think that's really critical. Because another theme that cuts across so many of the chapters in this book is the way that the framing of resiliency holds individuals accountable for structural problems, right? That if you had a negative response to a deployment, it's not because of the nature of war, it's not because of what you have seen or what you have done, or because you've been deployed 3 times, it's because something is wrong with you, that you have failed to cultivate the skill set to cope with that, right? And I keep having this quote from one of Marita Sturken's books in my head about the idea that this is an effort to make you feel better about the way things are, rather than about changing the immiserating factor. And I think that these essays really bring out the degree to which the resiliency program in the military puts the onus on the individual, and that our lack of resilience becomes about personal weakness, not about the conditions that the individual is confronted with. And it also expands that out, and I'm thinking here about Susan Carruthers' piece, about Robin's piece, which talk about families and talk about other kinds of violence beyond the battlefield, the epidemic of military sexual trauma, domestic violence in the military, the impact on families, on children. And this idea, and Joanna writes about this as well, that resilience creates a culture, this turned resilience creates a culture in which speaking out about other problems in the military becomes much more difficult. Right? That if you're struggling because of sexual violence, domestic violence, because of issues in the family, well, you're not resilient enough as a family member to deal with the stresses of military life. And I think that we see this radiating of resilience out to families who get enlisted within the cause, and therefore the daily stresses of deployment up through domestic violence, up through sexual violence, can't be spoken about in ways that address them. So I have a number of questions that I really would like to put. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to be brief. One of the issues that comes up, and Johannes' chapter raises this, but others do too, is the question of how we think about trauma in relation to resilience, and the model that comes out after September 11th, that most people who have a traumatic response to those events, but really, in my understanding, to any event, is they have a brief period where they have a negative traumatic response. They have a set of symptoms. After some time, those symptoms dissipate, usually on their own, sometimes with some therapy, sometimes with some medication. And very few people are struggling in a longer term. And that seems to be the approach the military took early on. And we were talking yesterday, one of the colleagues here and we're talking about what she called the skill and charybdis of mental health between pathologization and normalization. And the military, early on in the war, seemed to want to try to navigate that and say it's pretty normal to have a psychological response to a deployment, and most people recuperate, and and we don't want to pathologize it, and yet there's a move away from that, it seems to me, with resilience, that any response is, any negative response becomes a negative response. So I wonder, is that a model to which we should return, or is there another model of thinking about the psychological experience of war beyond resilience that is a better one? It seems to me that we need to be in thinking about war to understand trauma as a inevitability with war. People who were at my talk yesterday heard me quote George Casey saying the human mind is not made for war, and I think if we lose sight of the idea that humans are deeply affected by the experience of war, we've gone in a troubling direction. How do we, going to Peter's paper, how do we move to a community-based model of thinking about resilience and thinking about cultivating communities of care, particularly in the United States, where 0.5% of the population serves in the military, the number of veterans is very small, and the experience of war has been so abstracted from the experience, the daily lives of Americans. So I really appreciate the notion that there are these other models of resilience. The question is, how do you build the capacity in the culture to have conversations around war, to create those communities of care, when there seems to be this strong impulse to say the military is different, unique, exceptional, you weren't there, you don't know my experience, and where American civilians have generally defaulted to supporting the troops and clapping at football games and things like that, rather than really engaging with the military. So how do we think about that engagement, and what's the responsibility of the 99.5% of us who have not served in cultivating the kinds of communities that can help people cope with and respond to their wartime experiences? Does the shift to resiliency contribute to the greater militarization of U.S. culture? This becomes one of the big questions that Joanna raised, and I think one of the points these essays bring up over and over and over is that when in 2006, 2007, talking about mental health was a way of critiquing the war. Right? To talk about, look at what's happening to these soldiers that are being put into this terrible situations in this misbegotten war that never needed to be fought. And if we move to a model where we see soldiers, service members, as resilient, as not being touched by the horrors of war, does it make it easier to have more wars, because we don't have the sense of the trauma that will inevitably come along? And Joanna has a quote, I'm paraphrasing, but the idea that resilience in the face of ever-present war doesn't do anything to stop war. It makes it so that we can live with war, we can accept war. Maybe a question about the future is, where do we go with it? Where is resilience headed? Is the Army still, military still, are they doubling down on resilience given its evident failure? It's as I said, we have right now the Army has the highest suicide rate in 10 years. Most of the other active duty forces have a high suicide rate. The suicide rate in the special forces is particularly high right now among SEALs and Delta Force operators and so on. And so if we look at those numbers, we can very easily see that this resiliency training has been incomplete at best and unsuccessful, I think. I agree with the concept that it's failed. Where is the military headed now, and how do we use scholarship like this to reshape the debate about what the military can do? Has the weakness of the theory, the limited success of its implementation, caused any fissures? Is resiliency still the coin of the realm? Reading this and thinking a lot of these chapters talk about the history of the process through which resilience was brought into the military, and these meetings at the Pentagon between Martin Seligman and leaders of the military. And I was struck, I had a quote that I have in my book from actually a neurologist talking about concussion, but it applies here. He says, when the military goes to war, we go with the best that civilian medicine has to offer. There's military medicine is civilian medicine that's been adapted. And I think we need to think about that here. What are the challenges that come when you take something that was designed for a particular civilian population, and we can talk also about the quality of that research, and I think there's a lot in the essays about what Seligman's work revealed, how and whether that it did all that it promised to do. But when that work is taken out of a civilian context and dropped into a military context, what happens to psychological concepts, to medical concepts? And was this a failure of adaptation, a failure to understand that the military culture, the circumstances just wouldn't work with this civilian model? And I think we need to think a lot about how resiliency, this focus on resiliency led to and leads to an oversimplification of complex problems, right? That suicide, and Susan Carruthers has this wonderful essay about failed relationships and the way they lead to suicide. And I was thinking about another quote from my book where somebody said, well, in the United States, 50% of marriages fail, but we don't have a 50% suicide rate, right? So making this equation doesn't really work, right? And he was being a little flippant, obviously, but the question here is that we've seen this kind of oversimplification of complex problems, that putting suicide on failed relationships and ignoring larger structural issues, ignoring the conditions that cause those relationships to fail, which may be multiple deployments and the stresses of war and the way they manifest in relationships. So how can we move away from the way resiliency it creates this oversimplification and out into a much more nuanced and sophisticated appreciation of the effects of war on people? And one thing this collection doesn't do that I think is maybe a question for future research, or maybe it touches on somebody in somebody's essay would touch on it, is we hear a lot about how enamored of resilience the senior leaders of the military became. What we don't hear is how the enlisted folks further down the chain felt about being exposed to this, right? That, for them was it, okay, here's another PowerPoint I have to sit through, another box I have to check, and it's not really helping me at all with my problems. And has there been any discussion in the military, or any discussion among, any kind of movement among soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines to kind of push back against the ineffectiveness of this treatment? And then I want to close with something Robin says in her piece, and I think this is really, really important. The crisis can't be ignored, right? It's easy sometimes to, as academics, we can just say, oh, here's a thing I've written about and I'll put it on the shelf. But one of the things I love about the kind of work we all do is that it bears on really important policy questions. And we are in the midst of a continuing crisis around post-traumatic stress, around military sexual trauma, around suicide. And Robin says, and I just want to underline this, the crisis can't be ignored. So what do we do in its place, right? We have a wonderful set of essays here that show us many of the ways that resilience should be critiqued and offer really trenchant criticisms of it. And we do have some essays like Peter's that start to articulate other models. But I think if we take the work that the contributors to this volume have done seriously, and we should, it's a real call to us to say, okay, what do we then do? What are our alternatives, and how do we begin to use our voice as scholars to create the conditions where we can start to articulate and encourage the embrace of those alternatives? So congratulations again on a wonderful achievement. It's a wonderful book. I was happy to have the chance to read it in the draft. I look forward to having it on my shelf, and I will turn things back over to the editors and look forward to some discussion.
Those wonderful comments, David, and the time you took in it, the generosity in your reading. And as you see, I lied. There is no really time for discussion, but I just want to take 2 minutes. I thought we could go around the room and all the authors could respond to their questions. We have no time for that. But just to your final question about how people who are exposed to this have reacted. Just a couple of anecdotes. Milla, Johannes, and I were at West Point early in the project. And we had already worked ourselves up to this sort of critical reading and talked to some of these lovely, young soldiers who had had a tour of duty and were now at West Point in the philosophy and English department. And, they loved it because in the theater of war, when they got this sort of training, somebody was there for them. Somebody took the time to listen to them. So my takeaway from that was it wasn't the resilience as a training program. It was having an occasion to be listened to and to talk to that people appreciated. But more generally, I think one can't get around the problem of closed institutions. This is something we've talked about, difficulty in getting access. You mentioned over dinner last night that you were able to get, within 6 months, was it, access to protected information in the U.S. Defense Department, was it? Sarah, who's contributed to this, when she stood here in 2018, said she was putting in an application for access in Canada. It is still not coming through. So, what do scholars have access to in terms of responding to these issues? Of course, we do know there are many critical things. We know people talk about it's easy to cheat and it's meaningless. But it's true there are probably a range of responses which we haven't had access to. Joe, did you want to say anything to?
Yeah, do I want to say anything? I've got a whole list of responses here and I've got 1 minute. Actually, I think the most important thing you drew attention to is precisely where do we go from here? And I think that is how do we develop a more community-based model, communities of care? And I guess my line here, it may not be very helpful, but it's still my line, is that we cannot address these huge questions in isolation with other in isolation from other vectors of oppression, such as racism, such as sexism, such as homophobia, such as climate change, such as militarization more generally, that all of these sort of vectors of oppression are all linked. And so it's a huge task, in other words. But I think one that we're going to be speaking about in a few minutes in terms of creating worlds free of sexual violence. And I think the just one more sentence here, and that is that one step here, you quoted yesterday and today, human minds are not made for war, even though some neuro people think it is, and that's precisely why there is, a lot of that. But anyway, besides that, and they're rather cynical, but I agree with Nancy's point, which I agree with totally, but totally cynical, and that is, if it is true that human minds are not made for war and that war is innately painful, it's innately about suffering of us, then the draft and conscription is a way forward because we extend the pain to people who can avoid it. But that is a terribly cynical and horrible thing to say. But that's just my thoughts on that. Thank you.
So on that cynical and horrible note, thank you.
Thanks, David.